Welcome to the New Nordic School webinar with our partners GSE, where we are excited to offer you the opportunity to learn and ask questions on our panel discussion on the topic of driving change in your school, key takeaways from Finnish education. My name is Stephen Cox and I'm the Chief Education Officer of the New Nordic School. With me, I have Korpi, Counsellor Education and Science at Embassy of Finland, Singapore, Greg Parry, CEO and co-founder, Global Services in Education, and Laura, our Director of Professional Development from New Nordic School. Thank you, panel, for joining us. Perhaps if I could just ask you briefly to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you're doing here. Anna.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me in this webinar. Like Stephen said, my name is Anna Korpi and I'm the Education Counsellor for Embassy of Finland in Singapore. But I have the pleasure of having a sort of a regional role as well, to work in the whole of Southeast Asia, actually. So in normal times, I actually travel the region much more. But of course, during the last year, it has been much more of these sort of encounters that we've had. But the role is really to try to facilitate all kinds of education and also science cooperation across the spectrum of education, actually, from early childhood education to higher education. And of course, from Finland, we are in a very happy situation here, because in most countries, Finland is mostly known for education, and therefore the connections are easy to make. But also, of course, we're very happy to see concrete projects, concrete schools and activities happen in the region, and we support all of that best we can from the embassy and the foreign ministry side. But that's all from my side from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm very, very pleased that you're able to find time to join us today. Thank you for joining us. Greg.
Yeah, my name is Greg Parry. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Global Services in Education. My company sets up and operates international schools on behalf of investors and developers and non-profit groups. So we currently have projects in all parts of Asia. I'm based here in Malaysia, but we have projects across China and other parts of Asia and the Middle East as well. We're very excited to be partnering with New Nordic Schools with a plan to expand Finnish education across Asia and other regions of the world as well. So our partnership is very exciting. We're very passionate and determined to bring Finnish education to more children and to set up more schools across Asia. So a great stepping stone for all of us.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome. Laura.
Thank you, Stephen, and good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Luomanen-Jaakkola. I'm the Director of Professional Development at New Nordic School. My background is in Finnish basic education. I've worked as a teacher, school coach, and mentor for leadership teams and schools in Finland, and now here in New Nordic School internationally.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome. So our theme today is driving change in your school, key takeaways from Finnish education, which is a really big topic and area to discuss. So what we've done is broken that down into different areas of discussion for the panelists to sort of focus on. So for the first area of discussion, I want us to focus with the panel on really introducing the benefits of the Finnish education system. So Anna, this first question is for you. In your experience in both Finnish as well as international education, what do you see are some of the key elements of Finnish education that people internationally will find particularly interesting?
That's a very broad question, I think, to answer shortly, but I will try my best. I think in my experience and working with, for example, here in Southeast Asia for the past 2.5 years, and with international education much longer than that, I think that what the people are mostly interested in is our system as a whole, really, and it's sort of like, especially here in Asia, is always the question of how can you both have a system that is kind of like lets the children be children as long as is possible, and still somehow produces and achieves high performance and produces high performance, at least when we look at things like PISA, for example. And that's why we often get these questions that how do you manage with this less is more approach and your sort of trust-based accountability rather than the test-based accountability that drives many of the, for example, the Asian systems, and is of course quite dominant in most parts of the world actually. So we are a little bit of a odd birds in Finland for this. So and I think that the pandemic this past year has sort of highlighted and emphasized even some of the strengths that we have with extra burden, with extra pressure, with extra, let's say, increasing mental health problems, isolation, loneliness, and of course well-being problems in general with children out of school. So that we sort of see, and also what it has highlighted a lot is this sort of inequality in education provision and in education in general that is one of the deep problems, especially in the developing world, but also very much in Finland and in the West in general. So I think this is highlighted even more that how can we have this balance between for example, age-appropriate learning, student-centered learning, personalized learning, with and this kind of very holistic view on education and well-being at the same time as the high performance. And then, of course, come the questions of what are the secrets and that. So that's from my point of view the most what people are mostly interested in.
Thank you. And yeah, it's good that you mentioned about the system as a whole, and that's very important. I know it's very important to us at New Nordic School as well in terms of what we are developing. Greg, your company, Global Services Education, offers schools in Asia a variety of different curriculum from different countries. You've partnered with New Nordic School, and ultimately, obviously, your client schools are very interested in Finnish curriculum. Why is that, do you think?
Look, I think at the end of the day, when an investor, a developer, or a non-profit group approaches GSC, they're looking for advice and expertise about what the best curriculum and school choice is for them. And I mean, if I can be frank about it, they're obviously looking for market competitiveness. They want to be different. So they're looking for something that's different to the traditional models. And also they have a legacy usually. They have a mission. They want to make a difference. They've often heard about Finnish education because we all know that Finnish education has a reputation to be one of the best education systems in the world. But in truth, most international schools are of the other traditional forms, being UK, American, and IB. So they're curious and they wonder what's different about Finnish education. And I guess what they first realized when we start to talk about it is that it does satisfy that unique need that other schools are no longer satisfying. Parents want to move away from high stakes testing. They're concerned that high stakes testing is not the best for their children, both socially and emotionally, but also I would argue people assume that high stakes testing is academically rigorous. In my opinion, it's completely the opposite. I mean, why would you wait 6 months to a year to find out if your child is on progress? A good quality education model monitors a child's progress every minute, every hour, every lesson, every week of the year. So a more academically rigorous program is one that's focused on children, that's student-centered. And I think that's what's appealing about Finnish education for parents. They want their children to be focused on learning and also, mindfulness. We're starting to come out of a very stressful past year where children and teachers were faced with enormous stresses. So certainly Finnish education is popular because families and developers and non-profit groups want an education system that cares about the whole child, that helps them succeed in all areas of their life. And I think Finnish education is different in that regard.
Yeah, and I'm happy to sort of discuss this a little bit further and tease out one or two things you've said there in terms of this focus being obviously away from this kind of academics obsession, but more onto well-being and learning. You know, obviously, Laura, you know, you're I guess a product of the Finnish education system. Anything to add?
Well, I think that Greg pointed out very good points about what makes Finnish in education interesting, as well as Anna pointed out things like let the children be children and that student-centeredness. And I think that school culture is something that really has to do with everything that has been mentioned here before, and building a sustainable culture that allows all these Finnish or Finland-inspired things to happen in schools plays an important role.
So, you know, that, don't know if you did that deliberately, but that brings me nicely on to our next sort of area, which, you know, I'd like to spend some time on really, which is this notion of school culture, you know, and defining what that is, I guess, and what elements of the Finnish education system, you know, and particularly, I guess, from your experience of working in Finnish schools, and what do you think, you know, if you were to sort of take some of the best that you've seen, what would that ideal school culture be from a teacher's point of view?
Yes. First of all, I have to say that the school culture itself and the term working school culture is very Finnish, and something that's heavily emphasized when we are talking about high-performing schools. And we all know the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that's something that many Finnish high-level schools have taken seriously. So I think nowadays a good school culture is a combination, and leaders need to find a balance between continuity and structures and predictability, and then find ways of preparing the teachers and the students for unknown things like these black swans and wicked problems we are facing at the moment, and will probably face in the future as well. No one knows what the future looks like, so we need to equip the children with skills that help them to survive this world. And nobody can run or establish schools by themselves, and that's why good school culture has elements from 3 different topics, and that makes, I think that these topics all have to do with what makes groups of people teams and high-performing teams. And those 3 areas are human capital, social capital, and structural capital in every organization. And especially when we talk about schools themselves, human capital plays a huge role, and that's when we can start talking about what do we think about learning, how do we want to see our values come alive in the school, what are the attitudes we have, what are the shared beliefs we have related to learning, and how are those values and beliefs and shared ideas, how do they become alive in every classroom, in every lesson of the school. And of course, skills play an important role. We need to upskill the students and also the teachers in a way that helps everyone to survive in this complex world where both sides, the structural side and then the more unpredicted side is present. Then the social capital part, I think that talking and bringing communication culture very visible in the school, knowing that when there's pressure and when there are different things happening and constant change, how do we want to communicate in this school? How do we want to communicate with stakeholders and parents and everyone who's involved in the community? And then, of course, a good school culture from a teacher's perspective especially has to do with well-defined structures, with enough transparency, so that there are no hidden rules or something that's just unspoken. and a school structure that allows participation and collaboration with everyone, meaning the teachers, students, and the parents, and everyone who's working in the school. I think those are important elements when we talk about school culture.
Thank you. And Greg, you've been a school leader. You know, you've developed school culture in the schools that you've worked in. You know, what would you practically offer in terms of advice, I guess, to the audience in terms of, you know, how can they create and develop the culture in a school, and what are the main factors?
Yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about, Stephen, and I really like what you had to say, Laura. I think that we talk a lot about vision and mission integrity, meaning that a school actually is what it says it is. So often schools have a vision and mission that's used for marketing, but the behaviors inside the school don't necessarily reflect that. So we talk a lot about signature experiences. So what are the signature experiences that reflect the vision and mission that the school espouses to have? And I think it's really important. School culture is driven by personal behaviors, not by a sign on a door. So, I mean, a school might say that it cares for people, that it cares about mindfulness, that it develops good interpersonal skills in children. But I mean, that needs to be reflected in the personal behaviors of the leader, of the teachers, of the parents, of the whole school community. And one of the things I love so much about New Nordic curriculum and Finnish education is it very much embraces that. It says that the culture of the school must reflect how we think and what we believe. The underpinning values must be aligned. And I think that's really important to focus on. The values and belief in practices. It's not just a systems, the behaviors are not driven by systems. So to take an extreme example, a school that's very focused on high stakes testing their whole organizational culture is reflected on that. The children are moving in and out of boxes from exam to exam to prove that they remembered something that they've been learning for the last 3 months. That's not a good school culture. So I guess in closing, it's about personal behaviors aligned to a genuine vision and mission, signature experiences that reflect that. And I think it starts at the top, but it's a whole school community feel where everyone believes and values the same things.
Thank you. And, you know, obviously we're talking today about Finnish education and culture related to Finnish education. And you know, and we know that's actually at a society level as well, not just at a school level. So ultimately, you know, I'm based in the Middle East, and question I'm often asked is, you know, how can you export a culture from another country and in terms of an education system? So Anna, you know, you're based in Singapore there. You know, you must have experienced similar things in terms of, you know, exporting elements of culture from Finland. You know, what's your thoughts on that? And, you know, what can and can't we perhaps export from a Finnish education point of view?
I think it's very safe to say that the society culture and the surrounding context, it is not possible to export that, and nobody should even try that because we should always sort of value and appreciate the context where the children are living, where the school is in, where the education system functions. But of course, societies do change, but that change often is quite slow. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that I see in terms of exporting concepts from Finnish education to other parts of the world, because they are not isolated islands. The schools are not isolated islands, and definitely and that's where we need to have the appreciation and the deep understanding of the local cultures. So like you have just been discussing, I really like Greg's point, your concept of vision and mission integrity, that I think there's a lot of talk and even kind of like a policy level talk nowadays about going into these, like, well, for example, the holistic well-being and looking at let's say the more modern ways of looking at education, 21st century skills, phenomenal learning, all these things. But it's much easier said than done to actually see those things happen in the real life, in schools, in the real everyday life. And I think that's why discussion around culture and the sort of deep understanding of what does it really mean to be, for example, student-centered. What does that mean? So yes, the quick answer is that do not even try to export the cultures, but try to install somehow gradual change, but while appreciating the context.
Yeah, and we'll come on to leadership in a minute, which I think obviously sets the tone for the culture, doesn't it? But ultimately, I think as well at New Nordic School, we've recognised that we can't export everything from Finland, but things like vision and ethos, it is very transferable in terms of creating a culture within your own school as opposed to a whole country. That is possible. The learning environment, teacher training, for example, curriculum. We've got, I think, a very good question that's come through on the chat. It's going to put you on the spot, though, I think, panelists, but I think it's a nice one related to culture. So thank you for the question. It's very difficult for a different culture to adopt Finnish education concept. If I could take one element, which one element must I work on to bring out the best of Finnish culture and education, bring out the best in the children that they teach? What would be the one element that your one top element, if there is one? I don't know. Laura?
If only one, I would say student-centeredness.
And why that one?
That's because students are the reason why schools exist. And I've seen it alive. I've seen it. I've been living and breathing a culture where students are the starting point for everything that's done in the school. For every decision, for every action, we need to think, how does this benefit the student?
Anything to add?
Can I add, Stephen, that like our company has now set up schools in 12 different countries of the world. And one of our first projects was in India. And I was cognizant at the time, like, how do we take an international model and place it in such a different cultural context? And I think one of the things that I quickly realized is I had to reframe my thinking, and I had to identify what was the same rather than what was different. And arguably, Finnish education is not necessary to the rest of the world. It shouldn't really be considered something radically different, but it's a return to old. It's a return to the values and principles we've always believed to be true. I mean, the things that Finnish education brings to Asia and other parts of the world are the things that people have always valued to be true, to care about the whole person, to care about the well-being, to, of course, be academically rigorous and help children receive good results. So I think it's about focusing on adapting models for cultural context and celebrating what's different, of course, but acknowledging and aligning what is probably the same.
Yeah, and again, going back to the questions, there's some, there's particularly related to a country where I'm living at the moment, and it comes back to, so you take the Finnish education system, but we have a mandate in the UAE for inspection and regulation that schools have to go through year on year. So, and that's okay, but then ultimately, how does then a school in this part of the world, or schools, where they're under the spotlight from government, perhaps, which is not necessarily the case in Finland, bring in some of the aspects of the Finnish education? I think that's a challenge. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Lara?
Yes, I think that, of course, we can't export Finnish schools as they are, and as said here many times previously, it's very important to adjust. And Anna mentioned about gradual change and taking those parts that work. I think that when we talk about country-specific regulations and needs to adapt Finnish system to specific countries, there still are elements that unite us. Just like Greg said before, that we can focus on things that can be done instead of focusing on what the challenges are.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, from my experience of living and working in the UAE, particularly related to this question, is that, you know, there's a lot of pressure, I think, on leaders to actually comply, and that's important. It's necessary to have that, but ultimately it's how I think they deal with that and how they pass that down in the school that then obviously determines the culture as well. And so that's a very important. The leader is a very important buffer for that, you know, external regulatory factor that's going on, and not a transmitter of the pressure that perhaps that you can add in that situation. I think that kind of moves us on to sort of the area of leadership, which is sort of the next theme I want to sort of talk about. So some of the sort of key elements of school leadership in schools in Finland are very much about building this culture of trust and the level of autonomy which is given to stakeholders. So, you know, come back to you, Laura, and asking your experience of training teachers and school leaders in various different countries, and obviously Finland. How has the concept of teacher autonomy particularly been welcomed by school leaders?
Yes, this is a very, very interesting topic, and we've noticed that when we talk about teacher autonomy, it surprisingly raises a lot of emotions. And I think that's a sign that it's an important topic to discuss, and finding balance between the level of autonomy isn't always easy. It isn't always easy in Finland either. And there's no autonomy without trust. And with trust, there always comes responsibility as well. So trust and responsibility and autonomy, I think they all walk hand in hand. And for the real trust to happen, there needs to be a level of psychological safety in the organization, meaning that there is room for mistakes. There is room for critical thinking at all levels of the organization, and there's room for different opinions and real dialogue, which then can together and collaboratively bring out something new and take the whole school forward. And of course, when teachers are given autonomy, it means that leaders need to trust the teachers. And that takes us back to teacher training and upskilling the teachers with enough skills that leaders can trust the teachers. And I think that this is something where especially we at New Nordic School are working on, that we are upskilling the teachers enough so that the leaders can feel comfortable letting go enough so that the teachers can feel empowered and can feel that there is trust and autonomy, which are important elements for inner motivation, for example, and help the teachers then to feel that they have ownership of their own work and they can plan and have an effect on what happens in their classroom.
Thank you. And you know, you obviously have worked in Finland and Finnish schools. Have you got any experiences you might be able to share with the audience in terms of where you might have seen good leadership in practice and why you thought it was?
Yes, I have one example from 6 years ago when I was still working as a teacher in a school, and I was part of the leadership team and finalizing my studies in organizational psychology. And as a part of the last course, I needed to create a project or run a project in my organization. And together with my team, we noticed that the school values and mission and vision were not renewed for a decade, and there was this huge curriculum change upcoming, and we thought that we could align the mission and vision and values of the school with the new curriculum. So we went to our principal and explained the situation, and his reaction was that, yes, go ahead, do it as a team, create and run this project for the whole school. And I think that's a great example of our principal letting go and trusting and giving that autonomy to one team of teachers to run the project. And I think the best part and the best learning from this case was that he wasn't that concerned of how we create the process and how we run the project, but he wanted to make sure, and the part he was most concerned about was that how are the student voices heard in that process. So he literally walked the talk. He went to each classroom and asked and introduced the kids and helped that way to create the values and the mission and the vision. And for him, the most important part as a leader when creating and when running this process was that the children's voice and the students' voices are heard. And the end result of the whole project and the new values for that school were respect, appreciation, and trust. Very Finnish, and I think it's a very typical Finnish school change project example and the outcomes of it as well. And those values were heavily influenced by the students. So I think that it was a good learning experience for the whole community, that when you give trust, when you give responsibility, that's usually people are willing to take responsibility when it's given to them.
Yeah, thank you for that. And and trust isn't culture specific in a sense, is it? You can build trust, and ultimately, that's. But there is an element of the assumption being made first around being trusting and being able to give trust, and that becomes much more at a society level. Moving on to Anna now, in terms of your experiences of maybe sharing some good examples that you've come across in school leadership and any experiences that you may have witnessed.
Yeah, I think this is another very interesting and important topic, and I don't know if this is so much of me witnessing it, but I have been in this role and also in my previous positions, I've been quite a lot involved in, for example, setting up these Finnish international schools in different parts of the world, both in the Middle East and also here in Asia. And I think when we talk about, for example, private schools, and something that is very foreign to us in Finland is that how commercial education actually is in many parts of the world, and how much of actually the sort of financial pressure, for example, school leaders are also under. Whereas, of course, where we have a public system, of course, there's always cuts and budget restraints in other ways. But like you said, it's not so much about selling the school concept and the setup for the parents, for example. And for example, even some of my personal experience from Singapore, where my daughter, for example, goes to a local international but private kindergarten. Sometimes I'm sort of like thinking that is the message we are getting there, is it really the whole truth, or are they just kind of like thinking of what we want to hear and then we sort of get that message? So sometimes something I have seen, for example, with one of the Finnish international schools in the world, is that how much courage it takes for a principal or a school leader to actually even kind of turn away parents, because sometimes, as you know well, that people are very interested in the Finnish model, but then they would still like to have, for example, the test-based accountability. I see in the chat there is a question of how do you convince parents to kind of buy into this when they have themselves lived through and for long time lived in a completely different setup. So how do you make them believe and also have the trust that the right things are happening when they don't have the formative assessment to kind of prove that all the time. So I think there's lots that needs to be done in terms of communicating the full mission and the vision and the concept of the school, letting teachers do it with their parents and all. But then if somehow the message doesn't go across, then the kind of it's true. It takes courage and leadership to say that maybe this school is not for you. We are looking at a Finnish model, and if you just kind of want to have the Finnish on the kind of like a sprinkling on top, and then still want the things to go as they have always gone, then there's a question, because that has a big impact also on the community. If there's still a high pressure to kind of deliver both the sort of student-centeredness and, for example, the test-based accountability. So some things, and sometimes we have seen this, that the leaders really have to take a stand that this is our concept and this is really, and take time to explain it, but also then to kind of stand behind it, so that in a way that this is the concept, and if you think this is not enough for you or you are not comfortable with this, maybe it's better to consider another option.
No, that's a very good point. And yeah, I mean, we have a moral obligation, I think, in some respects, to drive forward the new agenda in education in terms of moving away from this academics obsession to well-being and learning, and ultimately, the pandemic has brought out as well that really the importance of examinations has taken more of a diminishing role, and ultimately we're now sort of looking at those skills and attributes that we all need right now, and grit and determination and all those competencies. Greg, if you've as a leader, and you've been in education, with all respect, for some time. So you must see this change now, and through our partnership, that what needs to change in education in terms of, I guess, moving away from what was important to what is now important. What as a leader, do you see the focus being for them, going forwards?
It's funny, I was just discussing this with my wife, Shanna, earlier today, and we were saying that if Rip Van Winkle suddenly came alive today, there'd be two things that haven't changed since he was first here: churches and schools. And sadly, those things do need to change. Everything else has around them, but many more reforms need to happen. I think, I often said during the pandemic period, people were saying, oh, well, this will change the world forever and this will change education as we know it. We were already on that trajectory. I don't think the pandemic changed anything. I think the pandemic just accelerated the plans that were already in motion. And I think we need to reshape our thinking. I myself have sometimes gone, wait a minute, maybe I need to open my mind a little bit and recognize that our schools need to be needs satisfying. And our children now are digital natives. Our children do learn differently to us. They learn faster. They learn more than previous generations. They learn more broadly, and they have a different set of skills. New Nordic Schools has a fantastic hybrid model of learning that we probably don't have time to talk about today, but we could talk about again in the future. And it's funny, 1 year ago when we talked about hybrid education, we would have talked about it being quite radical and unusual. Well, the truth is every school should have the capacity to have hybrid learning in its school. It should have high levels of technology. And I don't mean technology just for the sake of technology, but technology that actually accelerates learning and satisfies children's needs. There was a period of time when we were all younger where technology was used to entice or encourage children. Like back in my day, we had television once a week, and that was this cool thing that we got excited about, that Friday afternoon lesson. Well, gone are those days. These children live this stuff. And so I think we really need to embrace that. So I guess my recommendation for leaders is be discerning and be tough on new trends. But the question should be, does it accelerate learning? Does it satisfy the needs of children? Not does it satisfy me, because I'm of a different generation. I'm not a child in the school. But they need to ask, they need to listen, and they need to meet the needs of their clientele, which is children and families. And I think Finnish education does that better than many.
Yeah, thanks. And So moving on, I guess, we've got enough time for one more question, and then we'll take any questions from the audience. So moving on in terms of the final question, I want to open up the area of this, what we've started to talk about previously today, but this change in schools that's needed right now, and also in the future, so, I guess owners, schools have got a choice, haven't they? They can either go back to how they've done things before, they can embrace perhaps a new model of learning, or they can maybe do something in between. I don't know. I would really love to know your opinion on that. So how do you think principals and school owners might be able to achieve that? So Anna, a lot of change has happened over the past year, as we pointed out. What advice would you like to give to school leaders in Asia, particularly, I guess, since that's where our focus is today, and in regard to sort of contributing to empowering sort of school culture?
Again, a very broad and difficult question to kind of answer with enough of depth, but if I give in my 2 cents and the colleagues, then we'll continue. But if I at least think about the Finnish experience now with this pandemic, or what already was actually touched upon with many of the discussion today, we have deeply understood something we already, of course, knew, but that this pandemic has sort of underlined much more so that the school is much more than just a place to gain the knowledge, of course, or learn. The school is really like I would say that in Finland, in our system, we had a school closure of 2 months, and I think in considering how fast we had to go into that all, we did fairly well. In many of the mature systems where the infrastructures and the connections are in place, we did fine. But what the children, the teachers, and even the government has deeply realized, that the school is really a place for the deep learning, for the social connections, for the holistic development, and actually even a safeguard and sort of a last defense of the children and their well-being. So we have sort of deeply realized the value of school just beyond learning. And even though I fully agree that this has for sure has sort of sped up the digitalization processes as it should, and I'm sure that's something that will come out of this pandemic, but at the same time, where it has sort of deeply sort of reminded us of these, it's like a profound roles of school and the elements. So and I also very much agree with Greg that there's nothing really new that this pandemic has come sort of brought out. There's many of the challenges in education and in schools and education systems we already knew, and this has already just sort of reinforced that. So I think for school leaders, both in public systems and in private schools, policymakers, governments, it's a good time to take a really deep look into what happened and what are the lessons learned, what are the things that we need to keep, and things that Laura already mentioned many times, that what for example, at least in Finland, kept us afloat was really the high professionalism of teachers, the autonomy of teachers, so that they can really make up their own solutions overnight. Basically, they didn't have to wait around for somebody from the government or the education board to kind of tell them what to do. They did them themselves, and that only comes from having that autonomy, having that trust that like that we talked about already. And so these are definitely some of the things to keep and strengthen. And of course, I'm a little biased because of the Finnish education background and then my role, but definitely this sort of student-centeredness and all, I think it's something to very much keep and embrace. So I think many school systems are still very much in the sort of chaotic mode. So this is maybe not the first, the exact time for big reforms, but after the dust settles, I think it's a good time to kind of take a deep look into what happened and analyze fully with the whole school community. that some of the developments that this pandemic has not brought about, but shed light on somehow. So I think to kind of deeply remember this role of school and the education, I think it's the lesson we have deeply learned. And we have children and everybody has been longing for the school basically to open, which is a very good testimonial that it is really so important institution even today.
Very much so. Still a very important, integral part of society there. Laura, what about you? How do you think school leadership and teachers can contribute to sort of empowering a culture in both now and obviously the rest of this year and in the future?
I think that this last year has really changed the way we look at education and schools globally. And I'd say that, and Anna mentioned earlier about the parents, and I think that everyone needs to be involved, leaders and teachers, of course, but when we talk about school change and changing the cultures, there are no free tickets, there are no free seats, and everyone needs to be responsible. And I think that just like Greg said before, that this pandemic just accelerated things that were there already. I'm also a believer in that kind of thinking that we already know what's right and what are the next steps we need to take. I'd also ask every leader and teacher, what can you do less? Since school has changed so much and there is a need for change, it's always important to look on the other side as well and think, what are the things that we can let go of? And then the third thing, I would say that get to know yourself as a leader, get to know yourself as a teacher, practice self-reflection a lot. And then fourth thing is that focus on phenomenons. I think that what happens in your school is most likely happening in other schools as well. And taking that bird eye view and perspective to things might help sometimes.
Thank you. Greg, what's your final advice you'd like to give to school leaders this year and what they should focus on?
I think they should not make assumptions about what their school, their staff, their parents and their children need. We too often, as strong educational leaders, have our own past experiences to draw upon, and we make assumptions about what the next direction should be. So I think we need to have deep, strong connections with our people. For example, I know in one of our schools recently, we recognised that staff needed support. So of course we gave them chocolate bars and cakes, and we demonstrated we cared for them, and we said nice words and platitudes, and we tried to give them time out. But they also said that they missed professional conversation. They missed professional dialogue. We thought that they were tired, and they were tired. They were worn out. They have a really pressing year. But that didn't mean that they didn't want professionally engaging conversations that challenged them and made them think critically. And I think, we need to not talk past people and make sure we understand what is required. I think ultimately too, we need to remember that the people that make the most difference in our school are our teachers. So leaders need to get the obstacles out of the road. We need to remove those obstacles and help teachers get on and do the very good job that we can. Our teachers are phenomenal, but so often there are obstacles in their place because we haven't got things running smoothly, or there's too many things getting in the road. So leaders need to guide people, and we need to make sure that we shape the plan. But ultimately, we need to give autonomy within those boundaries to make sure that teachers can get on with the job they're really good at.
Thank you. And, we'll take some questions shortly for the final part of the webinar. So please, audience, post questions now would be great. I guess just to sort of summarize the discussion a little bit and sort of pick up on one or two things. I think ultimately, I think the change thing is an interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately, most people don't like change. And if we were in a live audience now and we had a session after coffee, most people go and sit back in the same seat they were sitting in before coffee, because that's natural, isn't it? But ultimately, you know, the bottom line, I guess, is if we don't change, then we're going to get the same results that we had before. And so, you know, I think as a leader, we need to look at that potential change that we want to make. And if I was to sum up what I'm hearing and sum up kind of what comes through certainly with Finnish education and my involvement of working with New Nordic School, is that there's kind of been a focus on education for livelihood, in terms of a focus on internationally on a focus on education for livelihood, in terms of this examination. It serves a purpose for your life. You have to get a grade, you have to do this, and you can, you know, carve out a career, etc. So I think we need to be much more moving to this education for life, where ultimately, you know, the skills and that you learn at school are going to be very important, and that's where I think the focus should be. Questions from the audience? Thank you, Andy. I think that, you know, going back earlier to what we were saying about the parents and, you know, convincing them and the communities that have been conditioned, and we've all been conditioned on this formal assessment, you know, and getting a grade A is the, you know, the pathway to university and for progress. So how do we actually address that issue and say a system that focuses more on skills and competencies and is moving away from an examination structure per se, but more to a portfolio of evidence of learning? Who wants to take that one?
I'd love to. I'll try to be brief, Stephen. But yeah, I think you finished what you just said. Then was the important thing is what we focus on. So at the end of the day, students do need to achieve well. They need to get good academic achievement to go on to future opportunities in universities. So there's no separation to that. That's going to happen anyway. But I mean, when we meet parents on a term-by-term basis and we roll out report cards and we talk to them about how their child's progressing, if the focus is only on the A, B's and C's, which actually don't really mean very much on their own, then that's where the focus is going to be. As you said, like portfolio-based assessments, or a model where we can look at the distance traveled. You know, schools sadly are judged on how many children get A's or how many children get into Harvard or Cambridge. Arguably, some of those students do well in spite of the teachers. I mean, what about focusing on distance traveled? What about those anonymous kids in the middle of the classroom who don't get noticed so much because they're not the naughty kids and they're not the smartest kids in the class? Why don't we care as much as well about them and distance travel those children from C's to B's and upwards? Why not a focus on Jimmy improving the number of friendships that he has and develop improved interpersonal skills? What about the fact that Jimmy's now learning the violin, or is doing something in the arts as well as sport, as well as academic as well? So I think parents will continue to care about what we shine the spotlight on. And I think it's important as educators to make sure our school shines a light on that breadth of activities so that we all care about those things as well as the academics. Don't worry about academics. Parents are always going to care about that anyway. But let's focus on those other things that we all know are important. And truth be told, the children are not going to succeed at Harvard or Cambridge or the finest universities in the world if they don't have good interpersonal skills. They can't think critically, they can't solve problems, and potentially can't adapt to another culture should they have to travel abroad.
Thanks. Anything to add from any of the other panelists on parents and, you know, and expectations and moving away from, you know, this mandate, I guess?
I can quickly add, and I think Laura, I'm sure, will add some more concrete examples, but I think it is exactly how Greg said, that it's a question of the language we use, but also it's a question of how professional we are in sort of explaining, for example, the other ways of assessment. For example, in Finnish education, we very much use, like Greg or somebody said in the beginning, we assess all the time. Actually, we assess progress. Are you better today than you were yesterday? So there are so many other ways of somehow getting that message across than just the sort of standardized tests. And I think, for example, then there's the fact that with the standardized test, it's possible to say that, okay, your child is better than this child. And this is for sure this kind of message that we need to somehow get across, that it doesn't matter if your child is better than this child. It matters if he is better than he was yesterday. So that this sort of like the kind of whole concept of assessment, what is the assessment there for? And I think to compare, to compete, those are not maybe the concepts that we want to embrace in nowadays education, but it's more the cooperation, the development. For example, are we talking about, look at your child every morning, is he happy to go to school, or is she sort of, for example, in my even in my daughter's experience, when she goes to the kindergarten, often our taxi drivers are like, she looks so happy to go to school, why is she not crying? Like, if she was crying, I think we would have a big problem. So that kind of things, if you like, again, shine a light on the points that we want to make and emphasize. I think those are very important as the sort of way to change the culture and the mindset.
Yeah, and final point to Laura, and very quickly, we've got the parental sort of mindset to change, but we've got a teacher mindset to change as well, haven't we? Who have become ingrained in how they're supposed to teach and how they're meant to teach, and we have to sort of unschool them, and they've got to learn and relearn. In a quick kind of 1 minute summary, because we have to wrap up, what advice would you offer in terms of how you might do that, how you might actually help them to relearn?
Teachers. Yes, I think I mentioned reflection earlier. I think that it's important to get to know ourselves, get to re-identify ourselves. Who are we as teachers? And I think a very powerful question is that if you weren't allowed to use the word teacher, what word would you use to describe yourself and your role in the classroom? And helping teachers with coping in this complex school culture is, of course, a task for the leaders, and for them to empower the teachers so that they can start assessing the children, for example, in this formative, using more formative assessment, which Anna talked about, and seeing the good in the children instead of seeing what still needs to improve, and praising the process.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for today's discussion. I get, such a deep, complex topic there for us to talk about. And I think, the questions are starting to fly in now as we have to go off air. But ultimately, we'll address those questions later. And there should be now a slide that you can see in terms of our contact details to get in touch with us if you want to know more about New Nordic School and what we're doing in terms of our educational system to drive this change using Finnish education system. And ultimately, I want to thank the panelists. So thank you, panelists, again, for your contributions today. And we hope that the audience have a couple of takeaways that hopefully will spur them into action when they get back to work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.